Hi, and welcome back to another Tuesday Lunch with a Scientist. Today I'm going to start out just a little bit different because we are in the middle of a speaker series for our online learning fundraiser about women with a series of speakers in women in science. So last night we had Melissa Christina Marquez, who is a shark scientist, on. Today we have Annalise Blum, who I'll introduce shortly. And let's see, on the 20th, we have Mary Ellen Hannibal. She is the author of Citizen Science. Then on the 25th, we have Jessica, who is a microbiologist. And on the 26th of August, we will end the series with Tucker Malarkey, who is the author of Stronghold. So I hope that you can join us for those. We have them all listed on our Facebook site and on our website. So please share, and we would love you to go ahead and check out all of those. Those are free. So right now we are in the middle of trying to raise some money for our online programs. We have been offering free science lessons to students and teachers, and we will continue to offer those through the fall, but we need help to support those. So as things have changed with COVID, we can no longer go into classrooms, and education budgets have been cut, but we want to make sure that kids still get awesome science experiences. We also have been offering digital science camps. So this summer we had one, a research program, and we will continue in the fall with a new program. You can check those out at headwaterscienceinstitute.org/2020-fall. And that's a great way for high school kids to still get an amazing science research experience without having to do something in person. And I know a lot of internships and after school programs and school stuff have been cut. So this is a great way to still keep your extracurriculars going. You can donate at headwaterscienceinstitute.org/donate. And that's a great way to support all of our programs. Also, tomorrow night at 5:30 live on Facebook, we have a question and answer about those research programs. And lastly, as part of our raffle, as part of our fundraiser we have going on, we have a raffle. The drawing will be done on the 31st, and so you can win great prizes. These can be postponed till after COVID. There's a restaurant and hotel stays, so if you don't feel comfortable with that, they can be postponed till after. And for little kids, we will announce on Friday a scavenger hunt competition, kind of a fun outdoor competition that we have going on. So check out our more things on Facebook and on our website to learn more about what's going on. So without further ado, I am going to bring in our speaker, Annalise Blum, who is a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And she's working on the prevention of conflict stabilization, environmental security, and cultural heritage protection. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the American Meteorological Society's Policy and Program Postdoctoral Fellow at Johns Hopkins. She's trained in water resources engineering, and she has led multidisciplinary teams to do research on floods, droughts, access to safe water, and ecological impacts of environmental change. She has worked as a research assistant at the Center for International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and served as a fellow at the National Academy of Sciences and the U.S. Geological Survey. She has a Ph.D. in Environmental and Water Resources Engineering from Tufts University and a master's from UNC-Chapel Hill, and her bachelor's is from Stanford. So thanks for joining us today. Before we get started with your talk, so obviously things in education have changed so much in the last few months. And we've been seeing lots of new approaches, including lots of use of technology in education. And some of it's new and exciting. What do you think about this use of technology in expanding education?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, I'm really delighted to be here today. And yeah, it is a really exciting new time to be able to present my work from my home in Washington, D.C. to you in California and other parts of the country and maybe the world. I think I've definitely been able to connect with scientists and other people. I might not have been able to have meetings with them that it wouldn't have happened if the meetings were in person, but when we're doing it remotely, we're able to bring together all of these different people with different backgrounds. And I think often the best ideas come from people talking to one another who might not always talk to each other, and have a chance to connect and come up with creative and interdisciplinary solutions to hard problems. And for me personally, technology online has given me a chance to learn new skills. And my research primarily in my PhD was based on statistical modeling, which I do using a program called R. And I actually learned how to code in R from taking an online course. So today I'm going to share some research I was able to do using skills taking online courses so that I could code in R, forecasting the Blue Nile River for Ethiopia's new dam.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so we actually, one of our fall research classes is to train students in how to use R, so basic statistics and coding in R. So we're going to offer a 10-week class that could be used in any topic area, but we're going to focus a little more on science because that's what we do.
Yep, great. So
awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, and I don't want to hold anyone up anymore. I'll let you get started with your talk. So you can go ahead and share your screen, and I'm excited to learn.
Let's see. Does that look good? Maybe I can't hear you. Great. Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm really glad that I can talk to you about this work that I did as a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. We were doing forecasts for the Blue Nile River to inform Ethiopia's new dam. And here's a picture of the controversial Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam from July of this year. Before I get into the background and my research, I just want to highlight that what we're talking about today is making headlines today. This is an article from this morning in Foreign Policy about how Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan are meeting to discuss this dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And I should say not all the science I've done has been so related to world events that it makes the news. For example, in my PhD, I wrote a paper on the probability distribution of daily stream flows, which is important, but certainly is not making headlines in news stories. But I wanted to highlight that as a scientist, you do have opportunities also to work on things like this that can have a real impact and be in the news. So I just wanted to back up and give you some background on how we got where we are today with the dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And so we need to talk a little bit about the Nile River. It's one of the longest in the world at over 4,000 miles long. And it is created when the Blue and the White Niles combine in Khartoum, Sudan to form the Nile. And the Blue Nile that we're talking about mostly today starts off in Ethiopia. And the Nile drainage basin covers 11 countries across Africa. And in particular, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia all rely on Nile River flows for a variety of water uses, including agriculture, human consumption, and industrial use. In 2011, Ethiopia began construction on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or I'll refer to it as the GERD from now on the Blue Nile, which is just upstream of where the Blue Nile enters Sudan. And the Ethiopian government has explained that they're building this dam to produce power. They both want to increase electrification inside Ethiopia to accelerate industrialization, but also they want to be able to sell power to neighboring countries. And the dam is expected to more than double Ethiopia's power generation. It'll be the largest hydropower dam in Africa. And the Ethiopians feel the dam is essential to moving much of the country out of poverty. So the GERD is really popular within Ethiopia, and it's seen as a point of national pride and self-determination. It's cost more than $4 billion, but it's actually been self-financed by Ethiopia. They've sold bonds, and there's also reporting to suggest that some workers donated a fixed portion of their paychecks each month to the project. And Ethiopia is a really highly divided country, but the GERD is a big issue that's able to unify different groups across the country. As with any dam, there are social and ecological impacts of filling the reservoir behind the dam that need to be considered. It's been estimated that the reservoir behind the GERD will flood an area of over 700 square miles, and that's what this picture on the right is showing. And according to the Ethiopian government, 3,700 households will be displaced. The dam was expected to have been completed in 2017, but there have been a number of delays, including the mysterious death of the Ethiopian engineer who was considered the face of the project in 2018. So Egypt is much less excited about the GERD than Ethiopians are. They've, in fact, declared it to be an existential threat, including most recently at a UN Security Council meeting in late June. And what this BBC News article shows is back in 2013, Egyptians were in a government meeting and didn't realize that they were on live TV and proposed military action against Ethiopia over the GERD. Fortunately, that hasn't happened, at least yet. And Egypt is really concerned about meeting water demands of their growing population, which is a big challenge, and it's expected to get worse with climate change. They're worried that with the GERD, there'll be reductions in Nile flow, both when the reservoir behind the GERD dam is filled, but also during long-term operations that could negatively impact Ethiopian agriculture downstream. And Egypt's really worried because they rely on the Nile River for the vast majority of their water resources, some estimate as much as 90%, and are really worried about Ethiopia having greater control over these flows. In particular, they're worried if there's a drought, how the limited water available will be managed and how the hardship of lower river flows in the Nile due to the drought will be allocated across these countries, of particularly Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. So there have been many news stories about this over the years since the project began in 2011, and Egypt also has warned that the GERD could heighten tensions and provoke destabilizing regional conflict. Globally, there's been big concern that conflict over the GERD could reverberate beyond this region and more widely. Since Ethiopia announced the project in 2011, there have been many talks between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, tripartite talks between these three countries, trying to come to an agreement about how the GERD should be filled and how it should be operated. And so while Egypt, I mostly have talked about Egypt, is really concerned, there's also substantial impacts for Sudan, both negative and positive. And one way that the GERD impacts Sudan is the changing variability of Blue Nile flows. And the changing variability of the river flows are likely to impact Sudan's agriculture. They also could have negative impacts on fish, which are really sensitive to temperature. If water is released from the bottom gates of the dam, it could be really cold and bad for the fish. But there are also a number of possible benefits for Sudan to the GERD. It might be able to mitigate harmful flooding downstream in Sudan, control sediment, and possibly expand irrigation opportunities within the country. So in 2015, these three countries signed a declaration of principles, including cooperation and not to cause significant harm. And the Ethiopian water minister has stated that the GERD would be filled without causing any significant harm to downstream countries. And what this map on the right shows is the site where the GERD is. It's that little red star on the Blue Nile, and you can see how the Blue Nile meets the White Nile in Sudan and then flows north into Egypt. So if the reservoir is filled during a dry year, it could lead to low Nile flows downstream in Egypt, but filling during a wet year could mitigate impacts on downstream countries, both Sudan and Egypt. And some studies have suggested that if the reservoir is filled during only 3 years, the level of the Nile River would be really affected, but over 6 or 7 years, it wouldn't have a major impact on the downstream countries. So it's important to have seasonal forecasts for both rainfall and river inflows into the reservoir behind the GERD to prepare for filling and operation. And so this is where my research comes in to inform filling of the GERD. we created the ad hoc Blue Nile forecast group in 2018. We expected that the GERD reservoir was going to be filled in that year. That was kind of the expectation more broadly. At the time, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins, and we worked with professors and researchers and students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of California at Santa Barbara to create rainfall and streamflow forecasts for the GERD, and then make these forecasts public on a blog to inform people who were concerned about this process of filling the reservoir. So first, I'm going to talk about our initial forecast that we made in 2018. I'm going to talk about how we made it, how we shared it, and the response and follow-up. And then at the end, I'll come back to the story of what's happened on this topic since 2018. And as you can see with that article from the first slide, things have been changing every day. And you'll probably see more stories on this topic over the next few days or months. So backing up a long ways, Nylometers were used for measuring Nile flows as early as 5,000 years ago. And the way these were used is there were markings to indicate where the water level was at a given time, and the priests would use this information to determine what conditions of the Nile the future held. But only priests and rulers were allowed to monitor these Nylometers. We approached predicting Nile river flows a little bit differently. We used rainfall measurements and we converted those into river flow. We're able to do this because river flow in the Nile and rainfall are highly correlated. So this graph shows rainfall in blue starting from January going through December. It's the average across years. On the vertical axes are rainfall and stream flow. And what you can see is that rainfall and stream flow have a very similar pattern, and that the gold river flow or stream flow follows the rainfall, which indicates that there's a high correlation. And so we converted our rainflow forecasts into Blue Nile streamflow forecasts using a water balance model that takes the rainfall and also precipitation measurements to predict monthly streamflow. So we used both dynamical and statistical models. There are 8 dynamically based models that are from global climate models, and we use these ensembles. So you have many models, and you end up getting a much better result if you take the average of many different models, it turns out, than just using one model on its own. And so actually each of these models, we had 8 dynamically based models, and then within those models, they had multiple ensembles or runs of the model. And we also used 8 statistical models, which take relationships between time-lagged climate predictors. So like this map shows at the bottom, sea surface temperature or zonal wind anomaly or sea level pressure. And using those, you can figure out a relationship to predict rainfall in the summer in Ethiopia. And so we used 4 published models and 4 models that we developed ourselves. And here's the blog that we published in May 2018. And I think I should have mentioned on the streamflow and slide, the time period that we were really interested in predicting is summer, because that's when most of the rainfall and the streamflow comes, and that's when, thus, it is expected that Ethiopia would fill the reservoir, because you have the most water available to actually contribute to building up water supply in the reservoir. So we published this in May to inform the next summer understanding of water availability. And our headline was average to above average Blue Nile river flow expected in 2018. And we did an update halfway through the summer. And so I'll give you a little bit more details about that forecast. So this shows our prediction of summer precipitation, and we're looking at model performance over time. So the black line shows climatology or historical rainfall. So that's what we're trying to predict. And then the dark blue line shows the average of our 8 statistical models and what they predicted each year. So along the bottom, the x-axis goes from 1982 through 2018. And what you can see is that our blue and dark green lines do fairly well. We were pretty impressed. hard to predict summer rainfall. Seasonal, this time period of prediction is particularly challenging. So we thought that this looked pretty good. But you'll notice something that we saw and is a little bit of a concern is that it seems like there might be a shift after the year 2000. And so the dark blue and the dark green lines are doing a pretty good job of predicting low years and wet years before 2000, but then after 2000, they're not matching up as well to that black line. Here's another way that we presented our forecast, and this was actually the way that we mostly used to try to show policymakers, because we thought it was the most straightforward. They didn't have to see all of those more complicated graphs you just saw. And really, it's just estimating the percent chance that we found that rainfall in this basin upstream of the GERD Dam would be above normal, near normal, or below normal. And we found a very high probability based on our different forecasts that it would be either above normal or near normal for 2018. And as you can see, so there's rainfall forecasts on the left and streamflow forecasts on the right, and they're very, very similar. And that is, as I mentioned, because there's such high correlation, high matching between rainfall and streamflow in this region, at least for the summer months. So here are some box plots to get a little bit more into the differences between the forecasts and what they predicted. We use these box plots to compare climatology, or as I mentioned, the historical rainfall, to our forecasts from those dynamical models I mentioned, the green box, and then the statistical models in the blue box. So I'll just do a quick refresher about a box plot in case you haven't seen them or haven't seen them recently. So box plots are a standardized way of displaying a distribution of data, and they show kind of 5 numbers. There's a minimum, first quartile, median, third quartile, and maximum. And box plots are also meant to show you about outliers and what their values are. So half the data fall within the box itself. So this climatology box on the left in gray has each of the rainfall for the years from 1982 through 2017 in it, so 37 values. And what it plots is how each of those are distributed across these precipitation amounts shown on the y-axis. And the long-term average is 972 millimeters, which is around the place where that black line that goes through the middle of that gray box is. And that you can see in the green box, there's an outlier. There's that point that's not connected to the rest of the box that's really high up. But the blue box showing our statistical predictions doesn't have any outliers and matches the historical conditions a little bit more. So what happened in 2018? The actual rainfall ended up being extremely close to average conditions. In 2018, between June and September, there was 963 millimeters of rain. So our prediction that it would be near normal or above normal, what came true, we maybe over predicted a little bit, largely in part due to that green box and those dynamical forecasts predicting that summer that there would be much higher rainfall. So just reflecting a little bit on this forecasting that we did and thinking about the trade-offs between the different types of models, we found that our statistical models that we used in this case performed better than those dynamical NMME models, North American Multi-Model Ensemble. But that's often the case for this region, actually. Something else that's interesting to mention is statistical models are sensitive to calibration period, or the period you use to fit the model, which is what we saw in those early graphs showing the dark black and dark green and dark blue lines. We were trying to see how well our predictions match the historical record. And then one other aspect that's important to consider is how the system might be changing and whether there are really changes in the system after 2000 that are difficult for our models to predict. If we're using data historically to make predictions, it's going to be really hard if those relationships have changed. So in terms of response, to our blog post. That it was covered in the local news, which was exciting. The Ethiopia Observer had an article with the headline, "Study Predicts Strong 2018 Blue Nile Flow as Ethiopia Prepares to Start Filling the Gerd Reservoir," because as I mentioned, we all thought it was going to begin filling in 2018. But one thing that I thought was interesting was that their main takeaway from all of these results I just showed you that were presented on the blog was that there was only a 6% chance of below normal Nile flow, and they didn't get into any of the other details. And so it was interesting to me that clearly what they're really concerned about is what is the chance of a year with very low water flows that might have a problematic effect for Egypt, that's concerned about getting enough water in the Nile downstream for their personal use and agricultural and industrial use. So we also published a peer-reviewed paper on this work, which is open access, so anyone can read it if you're interested in learning more about all of this forecasting we did. It's in Frontiers in Water. And I also wrote an article in a security blog because I think this geopolitical context of all of these issues is really interesting, and it's really important to make sure that even when you publish a peer-reviewed paper, as a scientist, for me, it's important to make sure that it's getting used in ways that help inform policy and decision making. And that's really in part why I ended up becoming a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. So what's happened since 2018 in the GERD? So we did forecasts in 2019 and in this year in 2020. In 2019, we really thought it was going to be near normal conditions. 75% of our forecasts expected near normal, and you can see a little bit more of the details in the box plots on the right. But actually, 2019 was really a wet year. It was above normal. So we underpredicted a little bit in 2018. We overpredicted a little. We underpredicted in 2019, overpredicted a little in 2018. And then this year, we don't yet know what will happen. Here are our forecasts for rainfall and streamflow. Again, we expected it to be a wet year, and so far it really has been a wet year. And again, you'll see this unsurprising that rainfall and streamflow forecasts are very similar to one another. So although the dam isn't completed yet, as I mentioned, it was expected to be complete in 2017, but it's still not finished. Ethiopia actually can begin filling the reservoir. In previous years, builders worked on the sides of the dam, but now the middle section is complete, and Nile River flow goes through bypass channels at the foot of that dam. But Egypt and Sudan have emphasized that it's super important to have an agreement in place before filling begins. And it's been reported that previous meetings of these three countries have led to over 90% of the technical issues being resolved, but they still haven't come to an agreement about how the dam will be operated during droughts, or whether the legal agreement is binding, and how disputes might be worked out. But there are stories that indicate the African Union-led talks are ongoing. Here are a couple of satellite images of the GERD from June 26th of this year and July 12th. With increasing river flows, because it's been a really wet year, you would expect water to start backing up even with those bypass channels I mentioned open. But what we can see is it really looks like there was a big change between June 26th and July 12th. You can see that brown muddy water, and it seems that water is backing up behind the GERD. And Ethiopia confirmed these images, but also said that the buildup of water was due to the heavy rains, and that they hadn't taken action to close the gates that would lead to permanent impoundment of the water. They hadn't proactively tried to start filling the reservoir. But then Sudan's irrigation minister said that water levels on the Blue Nile had begun declining downstream of the dam, which suggested that Ethiopia perhaps had actually closed the gates of the dam. And actually on July 22nd, Ethiopia reported that the first phase of their filling of the GERD reservoir had been completed. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. As we saw in my first slide showing the foreign policy article, talks between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, they had a pause, and they're ongoing today, hosted by the African Union. So yeah, curious to see how this continues, and something that I imagine many of you will see stories about in the news in the next few days. So just to take a little step back, quickly go through my academic journey in case it's helpful to the students out there thinking about their path and kind of how science might fit in. As mentioned in the introduction, I did my bachelor's at Stanford. I studied environmental engineering and I minored in comparative politics because I was interested in both of these topics and they seemed kind of disconnected at the time. And it's been cool to realize with topics like this one that I talked about today, they're connected in a lot of ways. I did my master's at UNC-Chapel Hill, again, in environmental science and engineering. And there I worked mostly with economists trying to understand how rural households in Kenya made decisions about drinking water. And I worked trying to bring together kind of hydrology and economics. In my PhD, which I did at Tufts, again in environmental and water resources engineering, I've been doing there's a lot of different ways you can put those words together. As I mentioned, I did a lot of coding in R, and I worked with the US Geological Survey, which was really interesting, and got to do more of this river modeling and understanding how statistics can be really helpful for understanding our natural environment right now and thinking about what it might look like in the future. And then I did this work that I talked about today with the help of many great people at Johns Hopkins, where I was doing my postdoc in global change, and the others I mentioned who are part of the ad hoc Blue Nile forecasting team. At the time, I was also working, again, with an economist trying to bring economics methods into hydrology so that we could better understand the ways water and humans interact. And finally, now I'm doing this AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. That's what AAAS stands for, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which has been a really great way to continue to use my science background to help understand policy and sometimes even get a chance to weigh in on how science and evidence can be used to make better policy and make better decisions informed by data and research. So with that, thanks. I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you. That was great. So anyone at home that has questions, you're welcome to type them in. But just to get going, I did want to ask about advice for students, since you were just talking about your background, about what to think about. A lot of the people who watch and classes that use this are either late middle school or mainly high school students. So what would you be thinking about in high school as you're going to start college? If you're interested in a career in environmental science or engineering.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that was helpful for me is really trying to find things you're excited about and that you're going to do a better job if you're excited about them. And so I think my first science job was I was taking gas samples from plants, and it was a really interesting study trying to understand the impacts of climate change on plants, but it wasn't for me, and I actually like coding much more. And so there's so many different ways that you can do science and you can be a scientist now. I have friends who study bats in Madagascar, and I think exploring different opportunities and not getting too discouraged if the first thing that you try, it turns out you don't like. There's probably some other types of science projects you could do that you might like more. Like I said, before I was doing the coding, also I worked some in Kenya, and there we were running household surveys. And so that was, again, research and science, but a very different type of skill set and type of experience, much more working with people and leading teams. So I think, trying things out and continuing to try different things if you don't like the first one.
And one of the things we've been asking the women who are speaking this week is, in your field, what percent, are you working with that are women? I mean, it doesn't have to be an exact, but over the course of your career, have you either seen it shift or stay the same? And what percent, are women that you work with?
Yeah, actually in environmental engineering, it's been a lot of women, which has been fun. I think that at least when I was in undergrad, the other engineering majors, it was a lot more men. And when I would take kind of my core engineering classes, it was noticeable how women were in the minority. But then my environmental engineering classes, there were a lot more women. And it was an interesting thing to notice that women seem to be interested in environmental engineering more so than some of the other engineering disciplines. But I think hopefully it'll continue to be more diverse across different types of engineering. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I had a couple of questions from your talk that I was super interested in. You mentioned that the statistical model tends to perform better in the area that you're in, like that's something that you knew about the Nile River area for weather forecasting. And why? And are there other places that the dynamical models do better? And do you guys know why one can perform better?
Yeah, I can. So I worked on the statistical models, and I wish I understood the dynamical models better, but from my understanding, I mean, they're built for the whole world, and so they can't be super accurate for every place. And the statistical models, it happens that in this region, we're able to find these strong relationships, or we were at least before 2000. It's worrying that relationship seems to be changing, but we were able to find these climate lag predictors that really did seem to come together to accurately predict summer rainfall in this region. And the reason that we take an average of the dynamical models is because some of them do better in certain regions than others. And so if we average them, we get a better estimate than if we use one of the dynamical models or another on its own. But they're working on improving the dynamical models, and people are creating new statistical models. So yeah, I think that happened to be the case for this region. And it seems to have been a pattern historically for this region as well, but that might not necessarily be true for other regions or even for this region going forward.
So I don't know a ton about statistical modeling. I actually did field science and physiology, like endocrinology in my background. So how often, would you go back and update a statistical model? Do you know what I mean? As this project continues, or as the GERD, continues to have effects, or is this something that just stays and the project's over? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we haven't, I don't think that, because I came up with 2 of the statistical models we used, and other team members came up with some of the other ones. I haven't updated mine, but I think if you do have more data, enough years that it would change kind of the relationships you find. So we used regression models, and if you had, I don't know, 10 additional years of data, it might change the model, and it might change your results. But with only 1 or 2 additional years, probably it wouldn't have that big an impact on the statistical model. So yeah, it is something that should be updated. And actually, some of the research I did in my PhD was thinking about if things are changing, what grouping of data is the most relevant to use. And sometimes if things are changing a lot, you actually don't want to use data from a long time ago that might not represent current conditions as well, if you're not able to model all of the ways that things are changing. So yeah, no, it's a good question.
I'm going to go ahead and grab a question from home, even though I still have a few more, but I don't want to be selfish. So Spencer asks, do scientists ever apply some of the modeling you mentioned in your talk towards dam removal, and when it makes sense to keep or remove a dam rather than just creating a new dam?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of modeling we did could be used for so many different things. And for sure, understanding how much water you expect to come into a reservoir upstream of a dam could be really important if you're thinking about dam removal. For example, with climate change, if there are certain dams that no longer, I mean, there's many reasons a dam might no longer make sense in a certain place, but one way that this sort of research could be helpful in informing a decision about dam removal is, for example, if you expect much lower flows to come into that area, and you don't think that having a dam there is going to have any positive effects, that might be a way that it could be useful. But yeah, I mean, this sort of rainfall prediction and streamflow modeling can be used for a huge array of different things, which I think is a reason that I was interested in getting these skills, because it can be helpful. One of my PhD papers was studying the impacts of changes in flows on fish populations, which also, again, comes back to a reason dams might be removed. And yeah, I think that hopefully we can use these sort of modeling techniques for lots of different important topics.
Yeah, so for example, Headwaters, actually in Soda Springs, California, there's an old dam that was recently mainly notched all the way now. It was holding water that they didn't have water rights to, and the dam was way out of compliance. And there's a lot of people, though, worried about the impact of that removal, like on flooding downstream. And so I'm guessing that maybe that question also was related to, to that. Like, a lot of people have worried that if we had high flows, would it cause, more flooding downstream and impact houses, since that dam has been there for so long?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. Because, other uses of this sort of modeling that I've done also are predicting floods. And that is often a reason. One reason that dams are put in place is to mitigate downstream flooding. So, I think you're exactly right.
I had another question. What do you like or maybe not like about work that is in the media so much? Like, you talked about how some of your work really, no one outside the scientific community is paying much attention to. And then work obviously like this, or potentially choosing a project about another dam, or, or a subject that might be in the media. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good, it's an interesting question. Definitely pros and cons. It's unfortunate that I am kind of have to be really careful, I feel like, when I'm talking about these things. And with our forecast, something that I wondered about is, like, if we forecast that there was going to be a drought, like, you have to be really careful about the implications of that. And actually, so far we've mostly forecast near normal or high conditions, but if we were forecasting that there was going to be a drought, but other people weren't forecasting that, it could end up in the media and have implications. And we'd have to kind of tread carefully in thinking about how to present those results appropriately, again, and trying to present the uncertainty that comes with any scientific predictions or forecasts in a way that is appropriate, but also communicates that it's not all uncertainty and that we do have real findings. In terms of good things, I mean, it's fun to be able to talk about things that people are reading about in the news and interested in. And it was funny because I actually kind of did this research in 2018, not realizing how much this was in the news. I don't know how I missed it. And so it was cool then, kind of like starting this fellowship and getting more into policy, realizing that everyone knew about the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And when I mentioned I had worked on it, people knew what I was talking about, and their eyes didn't glaze over when I started talking about the probability distribution of daily stream flow. So definitely pros and cons.
Yeah, and that relates to, I think, one of the things that often gets talked about in science is, so much work ends up just staying within the scientific community, and how do you bring work to the greater community? Is your work that, was on something that was in the media, did that give you any tools or ideas for how to bring potentially other work, into the light or beyond the scientific community?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't even realize at first, but a lot of people do press releases when they publish a paper. And so only in like my most recent paper, we worked with the Johns Hopkins press office and did a press release. It was a paper on how changes in urbanization impact floods in the US. This was, I was working with this economist. That was my other kind of postdoc project. And and the Scientific American picked it up and wrote a story about it. And so that was really exciting. And so even for topics that might not be automatically kind of already covered in the news, there are opportunities to work with press offices at universities to get kind of your findings out there. And I mean, again, it helps give you a chance to practice science communication and this important challenge of thinking about how your findings matter kind of beyond that little bubble you were talking about and have broader impacts for society or globally.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up questions. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off?
Thanks so much. It's really great to get a chance to talk about this, and good luck with your fundraising campaign. I hope that goes well. Everyone should look into that. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate you communicating your scientific results in a way that's easy for students to understand and providing them insight into a career that they might not have known about otherwise. So thank you for taking the time. It was excellent.
Thanks.
Yeah, have a great day.